Rob Venn here, and in this video I'm going to be textually analysing the poster for Marvel Studios' Black Panther. So the first thing we have to consider is, what is the purpose of a film poster? Film posters are promotional material. They exist to promote the film to the target audience, to persuade the target audience to go and watch the film. They're there to advertise the film, to make audiences aware that the film exists in the first place, but also to use various elements to entice the audience to come and see the film. Now, someone like David Hesmergalch would talk about the idea that film producers are going to want to minimize risk and maximize profit. And one of the ways they're going to do that is through using things like stars and genres and franchises to appeal to the audience. It's basically using a set of recognizable and standard elements that will entice the audience. It's like saying, you know, these other films you've seen before, you like those. Well, this film's going to have all that stuff in it as well. Now, traditionally, one of the biggest things that's been used to sell films is the film star. This goes all the way back to the 1920s. Before then, film studios didn't tend to advertise the name of the film stars because they thought if they got too big, they'd be too big for their boots and expect too much money. But they found out that film stars were actually an attractive thing for audiences. Audiences got to like them. So throughout the golden age of Hollywood and even into the 1990s and early 2000s, stars were a big deal. This is less true today. Now, that's not to say the stars aren't important for a film. They are. But what's become more important nowadays is the franchise. The franchise is a bigger selling point for audiences. I mean, no one really cares who's playing Spider-Man, really. Spider-Man is the draw, not Andrew Garfield or whoever else happens to be playing at the time, Tom Holland or whatever. It's Spider-Man that's the draw. So film stars have become less important, but that's not to say they're not important. The second thing is genre. Genre has also been traditionally very important. Steve Neal is the person we're going to be talking about as our main genre theorist. And we talk about the fact that genres are defined by their common ingredients, their generic conventions, their generic characteristics, or tropes. There's another word we can use for it. These tropes are repeated. They become codified and they become easily recognizable to the audience. They've been making Batman films since the 1940s. A Batman film today is not radically different from a Batman film in the 1940s in many ways. In other ways, they are radically different, but it's still recognizably Batman. In the case of the superhero genre has become very codified in a relatively short amount of time. They first started to become popular with like Superman in the late 70s, early 80s, Christopher Reeve ones. And, in the 1990s we got the Tim Burton Batmans, and it was with this new cycle of Marvel ones in the early 2000s that they become the cultural juggernaut that they are today. So the Marvel franchise in particular is the one that's taken over. So whilst genre is important, today franchises are more important. Franchise is not a new thing. Obviously, the ultimate franchise is probably James Bond, which has been making money since the late 1950s. Star Wars came along and reinvented the film industry in the 1970s. Since then, we've had loads of them, whether it be Hunger Games or Harry Potter or anything, frankly. But Marvel do it better than most in terms of their success and appealing to their target audience. So, let's first of all consider the stars. Now, what's interesting about Black Panther is that whilst many of the people who are in Black Panther have gone on to become massive stars, whether it be Chadwick Boseman or Michael B. Jordan or Lupita Nyong'o or um, any of those characters. They weren't especially famous when they were in this film, although they have become massively famous since. The more famous and well-known actors in this film were more the secondary characters. People like Martin Freeman was well known for being in things like the Hobbit movies. But he was probably better known for, the work he did on British television in things like, um, you know, the Sherlock Holmes TV series, right? Sherlock. You've got people like Andy Serkis, who of course was again well known from the Lord of the Rings films, playing Gollum, and was better known for his motion capture work on things like the Planet of the Apes films and being an expert on that kind of thing, and being Godzilla and all this kind of stuff. Not Godzilla, sorry, King Kong and all this kind of stuff. But the other big actors in it were actors who were famous in the 80s and 90s. So you've got Angela Bassett here, and we've got Forrest Whitaker. Forrest Whitaker burst onto the scene in, I think it was 1988 with Platoon, a Vietnam War movie, and became one of the most respected black actors of his generation. Again, Angela Bassett, Oscar winner, well respected actors. Yet they're not the ones that dominate the posters. They're actually relatively small. In fact, they're some of the smallest figures on the poster. Obviously, the poster is dominated by Chadwick Boseman, who wasn't especially famous at the time. He'd been in other stuff, but he wasn't the megastar that Black Panther had turned him into. Same with Michael B. Jordan, also came massive having been in this film, but wasn't the big star he is today. So, yes, as you would expect from a film, the main star is going to be the biggest element of the poster. And yet, compared with other superhero posters, he's not quite as large in the frame or as central or as important in the frame as we might expect from other characters from, the earlier in the franchise, whether it be Captain America or Iron Man or Thor or any of those characters. He seems relatively small compared with some of them. He also looks relatively passive. He's not in a wide-legged action pose. He doesn't look like he's ready for the fight. He is staring at us with this direct gaze, looking right at us. He looks very strong. He looks proud. But he's a bit blank for someone who's supposed to be the hero. If anything, Michael B. Jordan here looks more heroic, and he's supposed to be the villain. So that strikes me as a little bit unusual. Obviously, when it comes to the cast, the first thing that immediately jumps to mind in this one is the fact that of the 10 characters that are on this poster, 7 of them are people of color. They are black actors. This is exceptionally unusual, obviously, in a mainstream Hollywood blockbuster. Unless it's a film that is specifically aimed at black audiences, you don't necessarily get that very often. So that is unusual. But of course, this is a film that was consciously and specifically designed to speak to the kind of what was perceived as being the non-traditional audience for superhero movies, which was stereotypically seen as being white men 16 to 25, or roughly around that anyway. In terms of franchises, the one that's always done best with people of color traditionally has been the Fast and the Furious franchise, because that film has a very diverse cast of all sorts of different ethnicities and genders. It's appealed to a much wider audience than the Marvel franchise usually had. And that's important. It's important in terms of being seen when, you know, whether it be people of color or women, ironically, considering they're like 50% of the population, they're not used to see themselves being represented as the hero, And that's why films like Black Panther and DC's Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel and all these kind of films for Marvel and sort of like Black Widow and stuff like that. That's why they've become so important. It's important for people to be seen in ways that historically they haven't been. So this one was a major, big deal culturally for black audiences because they'd never really seen themselves being represented as a hero in quite this way before. So that's obviously the first thing that jumps out at us. The other thing is the sheer number of characters that are on this poster. Like I said, there are 10 of them. It's actually quite difficult to distinguish which ones are meant to be the heroes and which ones are meant to be the villains. Possibly Andy Serkis down here is looking a little bit more villainous. But other than that, there's nothing much to distinguish between the heroes and the villains in this poster, which is quite unusual. In terms of the generic conventions of the poster, it is less obviously a superhero film than many others in the Marvel franchise. Possibly because Black Panther is a relatively minor, or at least was, relatively minor Marvel property, certainly nowhere near as famous as its big hitters. To be fair, though, the Disney Marvel films didn't really deal with their biggest characters, which of course the X-Men and Fantastic Four and Spider-Man. So they've always had to deal with lesser known characters, whether it be Thor or the Hulk or Captain America, all of which were still pretty big to be fair, but not in the same kind of league as Spider-Man. Now all of this has been brought back under the control of Disney again, but you know, they've really, to be fair, they've been scraping the bottom of the barrel when it came to characters. Especially when that kind of started with films like Black Panther and Guardians of the Galaxy. These were very minor characters, only really known to the most hardcore or comic book nerds. So the fact that Black Panther became such a massive hit is a testimony to the power of the Marvel brand. So in terms of generic conventions, this looks much more like a science fiction movie than it does a superhero movie. And I think this comes very much from its futuristic looking cityscapes that we've got down here, these sort of like panther statues, I assume they are, but they kind of look kind of like robots. Um, all this steel and metal kind of effect makes it look much more futuristic. And all this metal, which I suppose is supposed to represent the vibranium, which is a key plot point of the film, gives it that science fiction look. The other thing is the colors. Blue is generally used to suggest science fiction. It's reminiscent of, you know, planets seen from space, or it's reminiscent of metal. It's shiny, it's cold, it's futuristic feeling. And that ties in with the sort of science fiction genre the Black Panther fits into, which is Afrofuturism, which is a genre that extrapolates what would happen if Africa had become the dominant social cultural force on the planet rather than Europe. So this is a genre which is very much being pushed to the fore by Black Panther because it was very much a lesser known sci-fi genre until then. So that's a brief overview of that, but let's have a look at some of the more specific stuff. There are certain things you need in a film poster. The first, and possibly the most important, is the title of the film. You've got to know what the film's called if you're going to go and watch it. So you have the movie's title pretty large on the page. Surprisingly, I'd say the Black Panther logo here is actually quite small. I'd expect it to be rather larger to attract people's attention. Also, at the top of the page, you've got the names of the key actors. There are all sorts of contractual things that are used to show the importance of the actors. I mean, there are famous things like, the main star tends to have their name on the left and higher up. Why? Because we read left to right. It's the first one we see. Same way as his picture has to be really big and large and at the top of the page because he is there to draw your eye. He is the big star. He has to be at the top. Usually, then the actors are listed in order of importance in the story. And they will have these little things like with Angela Bassett, with Forrest Whitaker, and Andy Serkis. These withs and ands, it's used when the character may not be that important to the story, but the actor playing them is pretty big and famous. So they have these withs and credits because it shows that they're important, but they're not as important as the main star. So obviously, Chadwick Boseman and Michael B. Jordan are the protagonist and the antagonist. They're the two most important characters. They get their names first. As I said, since none of these actors was especially famous when the film came out, none of them was particularly bigger than the other one in sort of like order of size or precedent and placement, except that, the more important characters are in the film, the earlier they are on the list. So we don't have any above the title credits. We do have a possessory credit, though. As I said, Black Panther might not have been that particularly important or famous or well known as a character. No one was clamoring for a Black Panther movie. That's not the draw. The draw for the audience was the Marvel brand. The name Marvel was seen and is seen as a badge of quality. You know what you're going to get. You've seen one of these Marvel superhero films, you've seen them all. And they want you to see them all. That's what the sort of like the end of credit sequence little stingers at the end are used to do. They're there to entice you to go and see the other ones. That's why they have all the crossovers where different characters appear in each other's films, and you've got the big team up ones like Avengers Assemble and all the other ones that have come since. So you have all these superhero elements being used to bind the poster together, right, and sell it to the audience, but it's the Marvel bit that really sells it, not the name of the character. Then you've got a tagline that's supposed to tell you a little bit about the film, Long Live the King in this case. I mean, yeah, it tells you that Black Panther is supposed to be a king. Which, on a sidebar, can we talk about the fact that for a country that's supposed to be, that came into existence by defeating the British Empire and kicking it out because they didn't want to be ruled by a king, how many American mainstream media entertainment products are about people who are only good at what they do because they were born into it? Whether it be Luke Skywalker or Neo from the Matrix, or whether it be Bruce Wayne or, doesn't matter. They're all born into it. They don't like learn these through hard work and skill usually. I digress though. Right? So the other things we've got to have are a credit block. The credit block is a legal requirement and it is used to list the key personnel, the actors, the writers, the directors, the producers, etc. of the film. Again, there are all sorts of complicated rules about who gets their name first, where it goes, and how big it is. One of the things they will use is in nearly always, not always, but nearly always, in a sans serif font. It'll be a very condensed, narrow font, and it will be very much stretched vertically by 125 to 135% maybe of its usual size. So very narrow, very tall, and very thin. This allows you to condense more information into a smaller space and make it bigger and therefore more easy to read. Not that most people care about the credit block. Then the other things we'll have is we'll have, the logos of the company that made the film. You'll have the date of when the film's going to get released. And in this case, the different formats it's in. So in 3D, RealD 3D, and IMAX 3D. Following the financial crash of 2008 and the rise of DVD piracy and file sharing and torrents and stuff on the internet where people were pirating and sharing movies, this took a major hit to the profit margins of Hollywood studios. People were no longer renting and buying movies, they were pirating them online. To combat this, remember this is days before Netflix and Amazon Prime and other streaming services. To combat this, the Hollywood studios wanted people getting back into the cinemas. And to get people back in the cinemas, they relied on spectacle. Big, brash, loud, lots of stunts, lots of CGI, lots of special effects. And for a while, they thought 3D was going to be the big killer application of the cinema blockbuster, the thing that everyone wanted to go and see, because 3D television sets aren't that common. In fact, I don't think anybody makes 3D TVs anymore. And they thought 3D was going to be the thing, but 3D sucks. It gives people headaches. It makes them feel sick, and it's darkens the picture by 20%. I don't think anyone liked 3D. Instead, IMAX has become the thing. Massive, gigantic screens. If anyone's been to the South Bank, BFI South Bank IMAX screen, that thing's the height of 8 double-decker buses. It's humongous, right? So it gives you that sense of spectacle and scale you can't get watching a film on your phone. That's what they don't want you doing. They don't want you watching it on your laptop or on your tablet or on your phone. They want you to pay good money and pay more to go and see it in IMAX. So spectacle and scale are the main selling points. 3D still around, but it's petering out. No one really cares. IMAX is the thing now. But then comes that decision in 2016. So we've got the title of the film. That's important. We've got the tagline, or strapline as it's sometimes called. We've got a possessory credit. Marvel Studios Black Panther, because that's a selling point. We've got our credit block, we've got our release date, we've got these kind of like selling points with the formats. We've got the stars up here, which are not as big a selling point for Black Panther as they might be for some other films. So those are the basics of the poster design. Let's have a look at some of the design choices. So obviously, the design of the sci-fi and, to a lesser extent, superhero poster owes a lot to not just comic book art and comic book covers, but also to science fiction novel artwork from the 50s, 60s, 70s, but also a lot of heavy metal album covers. So you got artists like Frank Frazetta and Boris Vallejo and all these kinds of artists who were, many people who actually did film posters, were creating these sort of like science fiction and fantasy images that would go on the front covers of comic books and science fiction magazines and album covers, and that's filtered into film posters and has become the sort of de facto design element. So we've got all of these characters that are the main characters of our film, and they're kind of like arranged in size of how important they are to the narrative. The more important they are, the bigger they are, and they get smaller as they go into less and less importance, or they become less and less famous. Or as I said, ironically, some of the more famous actors are some of the smaller ones. So what's also interesting here is the prominence of the female characters. Nearly half the characters on this poster, so 40% of them technically, are women, and they are some of the biggest ones in the frame as well. And they're women of colour, no less, who are generally underrepresented in all films, let's face it, let alone superhero action films. Most of the characters here are in very strong, powerful poses, all of whom seem to be looking over their shoulder for some reason. Not all of them, but most of them. Not entirely sure what that's about. It's almost like they turn back to look at you in an angry way. But notice how, other than the direct gaze we're getting off um, Chadwick Boseman here into a lesser extent of Danny Kaluuya and Martin Freeman here, they all seem to be looking off in different directions. She's looking off over there somewhere. She's looking up here. He's looking over there. You know, he's kind of looking down here. He's over there. She's looking out there. She's looking out. It's all over the shop. What are they looking at? Perhaps they're looking towards the future. Perhaps they are being watchful for threats. The point is, it creates an enigma, a question. What are they looking at? That entices us. It makes us think. What else have they got? Weapons. He's got this whacking great sword here. She's got her spear. She's got her high-tech kind of energy glove things. That's another classic of superhero movies and sci-fi, the combination of the new and the old, because a lot of science fiction films, and a lot of this is to do with Star Wars, to be honest, are taking the conventions of the Arthurian legends of King Arthur, um, mixing it with a bit of Western and a bit of sci-fi and some religious allegories, so like a Christ metaphor or a Messiah metaphor, mashing them all up together to create these superhero stories. A lot of superheroes are basically almost like religious characters. If we look at Joseph Campbell and his universal hero monomyth story, when we look at a lot of religions, not to mention legends like King Arthur, you will have characters who start off as lowly, humble characters. Christ, the son of a carpenter, disciples of fishermen, etc. They're lowly, ordinary people. King Arthur starts off as a lowly squire. Um, you know, Harry Potter is an orphan and living in some cupboard under the stairs. Luke Skywalker is just a farm boy. They start off lowly and slowly learn that they're the chosen one and become this messianic figure who rise to become the saviors. So that's a classic narrative. So they're mixing the old and the new, the science fiction and the medieval. So he's got his sword, she's got her spear. Interesting in that, of course, these long, pointy weapons are essentially phallic symbols. So this is kind of like taking a female character and trying to masculinize her. Swords have always been, and never actually been that important as weapons, usually. Pole arms, like spears, have always traditionally been the most important weapons. Swords, however, are expensive and were therefore symbols of power and authority more than they were actual practical fighting weapons. His armor, obviously, both looks leathery and futuristic, but at the same time reminds us of medieval knights. It's, again, everyone's got these power poses, legs apart, arms pointed, shoulders back, heads up, makes them look strong, makes them look powerful, makes them look authoritative. Slightly low angle, so we're looking up at them, and makes them look big and strong and heroic or intimidating. But again, like I said, it's difficult to tell which ones are the heroes and which ones are the villains. There's little to distinguish them. None of them are looking particularly villainous, except perhaps Andy Serkis. They could interchangeably be heroes or villains. Also, I might point out, very unusual to see heroes with beards. Well, I guess beards are fashionable nowadays at the moment, but it obscures people's faces, and traditionally people have often seen beards as being, if you've got a beard, you've got something to hide, you're hiding something. But on the other hand, masculine as well. So what other kinds of things have we got going on here? Well, we've got one of the classic stereotypes of poster designs is the head in the cloud design. Now, these aren't literally heads in the clouds in the way that some posters have, but this blue and white background is reminiscent of a sky with clouds in it. And they are lots of big, giant floating heads. So maybe not literally in the way some posters are, but still a bit of a classic heads in the clouds design. Color-wise, we've got complementary colors. Now, most films nowadays are color-coded in post-production, and you use complementary colors that are opposite on the color wheel. And since most skin, especially Caucasian skin, is in the orange color spectrum, the opposite of that is teal. Teal is a kind of blue-green color. So teal and orange are the two standard colors we see being used a lot. And that is replicated here quite a lot because the color of the skin, whilst brown, is still going towards the more orange hue. Again, the red of her top is in that color. It's sort of like this is as close to gold as it is yellow. Gold is kind of orangey in tint to it. So gold and blue really stand out. The gold pops against that blue background. It really gives that contrast. It's the contrast between the warm and the cold, the futuristic and the natural. And gold is very symbolic of wealth and power and authority. Gold gives it that futuristic techno look. So we've got the complementary colors. Again, everything, superhero films do this, but also science fiction films. The ting of light is a big deal. Whether it be the glow of her energy weapons or the fact that these kind of like the kind of glow that's coming off these statues of the Black Panthers, the kind of glow that's coming off the metal, these little tings here, for example. Classic superhero trope, but also classic trope of science fiction films. As I said, the size of the characters denotes their importance. The size of the Marvel Studios logo shows us the power of the brand. The sight lines, like I said, create a sense of enigma. But one of the key things I think here is this very geometric looking pattern. This triangle that sort of like resembles a kind of like some kind of pyramid. This visually draws the eye up through the middle from the title, which is possibly the first thing that attracts us, and it points the way to look up towards Chadwick Boseman here. Equally, the cross shape, again, draws our eye to the center of the image and to Chadwick Boseman's face. The circular shape behind him and these kind of branch out almost like wings. And that circular shape is kind of reminiscent of a halo. So it kind of has a religious element there, and it kind of makes him look like some kind of angel, I suppose, with these wings and this sort of like halo effect going on behind him. The diagonals are also a very strong shape. Again, even the characters here are arranged in kind of an X. It's very strong, it's powerful. It's diagonals tend to make things look fast, as if they're leaning forward, looking towards the future, going forward. So a very strong shape. Again, the way these lines here go up and then in, up and in, it draws our attention all the time back to Chadwick Boseman. As does his necklace, look, the shape of the teeth on this necklace, kind of like almost like arrows pointing to his face. So, to a certain extent, this is a poster that is selling the character, not the star. Again, Chadwick Boseman may have become hugely famous after this, but he wasn't at the time. So very few people knew who he was. So Black Panther was the selling point, not Chadwick Boseman. All of this has got a traditional, these kind of remind me of like the Gozer things from Ghostbusters. But again, it's got a typical science fiction-y feel. It does remind me a little bit of films like Dark City, actually. The sort of like Alex Proyas's sort of like science fiction detective story. I really like the sort of like the patterns on here as well. I suppose they're meant to be African, I guess, or Asian, because some of it's sort of like set in South Korea. But I think this is sort of like the Wakandan language they've invented, these pictograms. But nonetheless, it's got a kind of like an Art Deco feel to it. There's sort of like, but that was the thing with Art Deco. Art Deco, as a design in the 1920s, had a very post-colonialist attitude. It was very much influenced by the discoveries that were being made in Egypt by Howard Carter as he was in uncovering the tomb of Tutankhamun. So Art Deco was very much influenced by this post-colonialism and the other, as Edward Syed would talk about. So there's that crossover there. But nonetheless, it's supposed to be these African designs. But this doesn't lean that heavily into the Africanness of Black Panther, not as much as some of the other posters did. Angela Bassett's outfit here, especially this headdress, has got a kind of African element to it. So has Forest Whitaker's robes here, but the rest of it is kind of like toning down the Afrofuturist element of it in comparison to many of the other posters. So that, I think, covers many of the basics of that poster. See if you can come up with any more. The more you can think about, the better. But this is very different, obviously, to the I, Daniel Blake poster, which has a very, very, very different way of selling the film. One of the things this clearly doesn't have on it, it's not got any quotes. It's not got any quotes from critics or newspapers or magazines or anything like that, because you don't need that kind of stuff to sell a Marvel movie. It sells itself almost. It's not got any awards on it. Black Panther didn't win that much in the way of awards. Certainly didn't win anything major. It's not going to win a Palme d'Or or a Silver Bear or something like that, is it? Although it was nominated for Oscars, don't think it won much of any, if any. So, whilst the film may have had a lot of cultural impact, it wasn't that very well received critically, relatively speaking, because it's a mainstream studio movie and they're never really well received critically. They don't get much in the way of acclaim. Genre films never have, whether it be sci-fi or horror or superhero movies or whatever, with the odd exception. So, very different to the poster for I, Daniel Blake, which we will look at later. Right, okay, that'll do for now. If you've got any questions, you know where to find me, and I'll see you in the next one.